Good afternoon, fellow patriots and defenders of democracy. Welcome to The Notion of the Madness, and as I'm here, my personal opinion here would be anything attached to a bank is usually attached to someone doing some scummy thing to exploit the people who don't have. The irony of our financial system is that typically, people who have get better rates and better access, which is ridiculous because technically they don't really need it, but that's just the way the system is. So that's just the way the playing field is set. I'm going to read you something before I even go anywhere. When banks write reports, typically their reports are usually trying to convince you of ways to maximize profits and people to exploit. It's very rare that a bank actually puts out information that could be socially beneficial to everybody there and could inform people. Now, the next issue here is this information that I'm about to read, and this is going to be a very boring video. I don't think I should summarize it, so I'm going to make numerous parts of it, reading it, and in essence, in the event you actually listen to what I'm saying, or can make out what I'm reading, or read this amount of information yourself, we can have a conversation about it in the comment section, and we will commence. The economic cost of U.S. racial inequality. A useful definition of racial equity hails from the San Francisco Fed. Racial equity means just and fair inclusion in an economy in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We know we have achieved racial equity when race no longer predicts life outcomes. A plethora of data, studies, and societal ills indicate the U.S. has yet to achieve the point of racial equity given the prevalence of major gaps in economic opportunity, education, income, housing, and wealth that run along racial fault lines. The COVID-19 pandemic and the deaths of several black people while in police custody in rapid succession have laid bare the United States' long-standing problem of discrimination against minority groups, especially against black people. Moreover, it has laid bare how inequality has produced real economic costs and social losses. These causes are more evident in racial gaps, wide numerical differences in key societal and economic indicators between black and white Americans. These gaps are apparent in unemployment, net worth, debt levels, wages, peak income, financing for businesses, spending on education, and rates of imprisonment and sentencing levels. The gaps in many cases remain wide 60 years after the civil rights movement in some cases, including in home ownership rates and college degree attainment. The gaps are wider now than in 1950s and 60s. This report, 1, identifies the underlying causes of the racial and economic gaps exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. 2, discusses the value of closing gaps, and 3, outlines how government, corporations, and individuals can work together to eliminate gaps for good. We discover that closing racial gaps in a Pareto improvement to both improvement to both the U.S. economy and society. If racial gaps for blacks had been closed 20 years ago, U.S. GDP could have benefited by an estimated $16 trillion. If we close gaps today, the equivalent add to the U.S. economy over the next 5 years could be $5 trillion of additional GDP, or an average add of 0.35% points to U.S. GDP growth per year and 0.09% points to global GDP growth per year. Closing the black bulletproof highlights. Closing the black racial wage gap 20 years ago might have provided an additional $2.7 trillion in income available for consumption and investment. Improving access to housing credit might have added an additional 770,000 black homeowners over the last 20 years, with combined sales and expenditures adding another $218 billion to GDP over that time. Facilitating increased access to higher education, college, graduate, and vocational schools for black students might have bolstered lifetime incomes that in aggregate sums to $90 to $113 billion. Providing foreign equitable lending to black entrepreneurs might have resulted in the creation of an additional $13 trillion in business revenue over the last 20 years. This could have been used for investments in labor, technology, capital, equipment, and structures, and 6.1 million jobs might have been created per year. Closing the wage gap, closing the wage, housing, education, and business investment racial gaps can help narrow the wealth gap, which is significant, facilitating home ownership, businesses, and job creation, plus establishing a pipeline for intergenerational wealth accumulation. That is a lot to take in. This is just the beginning. And this is exactly why I was saying I don't really see how we could summarize this. However, to continue, the dual health and economic crisis resulting from the coronavirus lays bare long simmering racial tensions and inequities that have plagued the U.S. for centuries. The overlay of deep job cuts, threat of eviction, hunger, business closures among minority groups, and uneven fiscal support with high rates of infections and death, plus repeated incidents of police brutality involving Black Americans have proven too great to ignore. The results not only has precipitated protests in the streets, but also a general reassessment of the very soul of the nation, specifically how past and current biases have embedded themselves into the economy and society and what should be done to rectify them. While all racial and ethnic groups are suffering from the fallout of the pandemic, data reveals the burden is falling more heavily on certain demographics. Black persons in particular appear to have suffered greater job loss amid government-ordered shutdowns, found themselves in industries that are essential but low-paying, possess more pre-existing factors leading to COVID-19 mortality, owned businesses that closed permanently or were unable to access Paycheck Protection Program loans, and reported elevated rates of food, income, and housing insecurity amid the crisis. The tangible and emotional hardship of the virus impact spilled over into national outrage about the deaths of several Black people during altercation with the police, most notably the videotaped death of George Floyd. The combination of the pandemic and deadly community policing tactics led us to revisit the problem of racial gaps in the U.S. and the case for closing them. First, we review the disproportionate impact of the virus on minority groups and Black persons in particular, plus the linkage of pre-existing racial gaps. The health divide. Ethnic minorities were more likely to contract and perish from COVID-19. Death rates tallied by the U.S. Center for Disease Control from New York, a particularly hard-hit region, showed mortality rates for Blacks, African American persons 92.3 deaths per 100,000 of the population, and Hispanic Latino persons 74.3 were substantially higher than that of white 42.2 or Asian 34.5 respectively. A Federal Reserve Bank of New York study reveals there is a high significant debt from COVID-19 and the existence of various conditions, including belonging to a low-income group, living in a densely populated urban area, and or being a member of a major minority group. Indeed, an overlay of COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. counties have large minority population indicates a higher prevalence of perishing from COVID-19 prevalence. If one belongs to a racial minority, Black, Hispanic, and Native American, plus select Asian and Pacific Islander population groups. Federal data corroborate the racial disparity of COVID-19 death. The Center for Disease Control stated that contributing factors include living condition, densely populated, residential segregated, multi-generation households, incarceration, work circumstances, critical workers, lack of paid sick leave, and underlying health condition, lack of access to health insurance, serious underlying medical conditions, stigma, and systematic inequalities. Regarding health condition, the SHADAC analysis of the American Community Survey public use microdata sample files reveal that although the number of uninsured persons has fallen since the passage of the Affordable Care Act in 2012, ethnic minorities are still less likely to have health insurance. The eroded sentiment among minorities among the pandemic and Black Americans in particular reflect not only policing and healthcare inequalities, but also long simmering economic disparities. Both the wealth and income gaps between Black and Hispanic families and white and Asian families have remained wide over the last 40 years, for which the U.S. Census Bureau has collected data. The real median income and wealth disparities continue to be stark for Black Americans. These gaps have been exacerbated by business shutdowns amid the coronavirus pandemic. In the latest Bureau of Labor Statistics employment report, The civilian unemployment rate in the U.S. continues to edge lower. Nonetheless, jobless rates are falling for white persons faster than that for other minorities, and the unemployment rate for black workers at 13.0% is the highest. Moreover, the NBER reported there was greater business destruction over the February to April 2020 span for black-owned firms in terms of percentage decline than for business owned by other ethnicities. We're transitioning into the securities. Insecurity. Managing the basics of daily living has been more difficult for black households amid the COVID-19 pandemic. Food sufficiency has been a greater challenge for select households of color and black households in particular due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Census Bureau's Household Plus survey revealed that in June 2020 it was more likely the case for black, Hispanic, and other racial category households to have inadequate access to food during the pandemic than was the case for white and Asian households. Black households were more likely to say that they sometimes or often did not have enough to eat. Meanwhile, it was more likely that black households fell behind on rent or mortgage payments amid the coronavirus pandemic than white households. Black households were also less confident they could make future housing payments than were white households. Essential versus non-essential. Food and the housing insecurity during the pandemic were directly linked to the unequal nature of job losses that heavily affected low-skilled discretionary sectors employing large shares of minorities. The U.S. Private Sector Job Quality Index listed jobs in the food and beverage services, retail, travel, and attractions, and the auto sector among the most vulnerable amid COVID-19 disruptions. Many of these jobs rank low in the quality index. The JQI interprets job quality as measuring the weekly dollar income a job generates for an employee. Hence, it is also likely many of these jobs have low skill requirements given the relative low quality of pay. U.S. job cuts among these sectors were disproportionately skewed towards women and minorities due to labor market segmentation into areas that were discretionary in nature and or impossible to execute in a work-from-home scheme. Indeed, a staggering 14 million white workers were laid off. But this is compared to 8 million minorities, which comprise 23% of the working age population. In the second quarter of 2020, black persons working in coronavirus disrupted sensitive sectors experienced an employment loss of 2.7 million. However, as shares of the number of employed black persons 1 year prior, the loss was 14% compared to 12% for whites. For Hispanic and Asian people, the loss was 15% each. For black persons who maintained their jobs, the split between essential and non-essential work highlighted that the most hazardous jobs are also among those with the lowest pay. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 30% of U.S. workers are able to telework, work from home, or WFH. Hispanic and black workers were the least able to work from home. The Bureau of Labor Statistics also reported laborers who are below the 50th percentile in terms of wage level were the least likely to work from home, less than the 25 percentile and 25 to 50 percentile. Moreover, many of the jobs deemed essential by government were the least amendable to work from home. Of essential jobs with high exposure to infection, many of them are low-wage jobs in which black workers are clustered. Healthcare, food service, and childcare stand out as low-wage, essentially occupation employing large numbers of black employees. All right. Essentially what they were saying there is the work percentile, well, the pay percentile is break up in 20%. Bottom 20, second layer from the bottom, mid 20, which would be the 60 percentile, other 20, which would be in the 80, top 20, which would be 80 to 100. 50% would be where the majority of the black community and minority community hang out, and disproportionately goes down, doesn't really go up, and that's pretty much how that was really distributed. I'm going to finish this thing in regards to the uneven relief, and then I'm going to wrap up this video, but there'll be more of it, and I'll continue. The CARES Act of 2020 legislated the Paycheck Protection Program, which provided loans to businesses suffering coronavirus disruption. The potentially forgivable loans are designed to encourage firms to invest and retain workers until domestic demand improved. The Bloomberg News analysis of small businesses data revealed that in the initial wave of the program, minority-owned firms received fewer loans as a share of the total number of minority-owned business, 17%, than did white-owned firms, 27%. The percentages improve and largely even out in the second tranche of PPP loans at 75 and 72% respectively. Nonetheless, minority firms found themselves shut out of the initial round of relief and struggled to receive funding from large financial institutions at the outset of the pandemic disruption, as the availability of community banks expedited lending. This is going to be a lot of information to take in. In the event you made it this far, thank you for sticking around. In the event you didn't, and you were clicking around and you got to this point, the majority of this video won't make any sense unless you listen to it in its entirety, and I apologize for that, but I don't think I should summarize anything that these people are saying. It's a lot of valuable information depending on how you may see it, but it's also able to be utilized in many other facets. Thank you. I'm sorry for not joking around or having anything enlightening or lighten the mood to say right now. I have a host of these videos to make, and hopefully we'll finish this and we can all, I don't know, improve or find a way to address something or improve something going forward. But thank you for hanging out. Like and subscribe if you like what you're hearing or want to be involved in the conversation. But other than that, thank you once again, and hope to see you next time. Peace.